Hi, welcome to session 3 of the third topic of the semester, Texas in the Mexican Nation, 1821 to 1836. So this is the third session, and here we're going to cover the remaining portion of this topic, in which we're now going to look at the ordeals of the Mexican nation. So we're going to see the formation of Mexico, the constitutions or experiments that were tried, and some of the problems, again, that this country had during the first initial years, particularly when we're looking at this period of Mexican Texas, and how those problems are going to affect Texas itself during this period. And in the last portion, we're going to look at the society, particularly of Texas, Mexican Texas, the society from 1821 to 1836. So again, so this is covering the remaining portion of this topic. And now let's proceed to go to our slide. Okay, so this is something I introduced at the end of session 2. I provided a very quick overview, quick introduction of part 2, the ordeals of the new Mexican nation, and in terms of just going over one of the most fundamental problems that the new nation of Mexico is going to have. And of course, this is going to affect Mexican history throughout the 19th century, by the way. And that is, again, this political instability that was so characteristic of Mexico during the 19th century was due to the ideological divisions, again, that the country had in terms of two groups that are going to be competing in Mexico for shaping the country, for shaping the nation, for shaping the economic and political institutions. So the criollos, in this case, those are the Spanish born in America, or at this time, they're just, again, the people of Spanish ancestry, period, who had won independence, are going to divide themselves almost immediately after independence was won, because suddenly there were two visions of the future that the criollos are going to present. So the criollos, again, are going to divide themselves into two ideological camps, the liberals and the conservatives, as they were known. And again, those ideological divisions will persist throughout the 19th century. This is going to cause a lot of problems, again, for Mexico. There will be significant instability in this country, as it was not able to form a cohesive nation state, because every time one group will come into power and try to build the institutions, then the other will be working diligently to pretty much dismantle those institutions and seize the state in order to change the course of the country and change the institutions. So I think this went back and forth across the 19th century, with very relative period of stability. Perhaps the end of the 19th century, we're going to see a relative period of stability at the end of the 19th century. But again, here we're not going to discuss that. We're just going to look at, again, the difficulties that the country is having to build a nation, to build a constitution, and to govern all the states according to, again, the principles that, again, the country agrees, but the country does not agree to those principles, because there's divisions, of course. The liberals, as I mentioned, prefer a country very similar to the United States, a federal republic. They want a federal republic in which there's going to be distribution of powers between the federal level to the states and the local governments. In other words, what the liberals want is, again, that the states retain a certain degree of independence, not 100%, but a certain degree, that the states are able to craft their own laws, they pass their own taxes, etc., that are unique, that correspond to the values, the needs of that particular state. Because no two states are identical. They're very different. So all the states are different geographically, population-wise, culturally, if you will. So what the liberals want is for the states to have a certain degree of independence, and also the local towns, again, the towns themselves, the municipalities as they were called, to be also independent in terms of every town be governed by the local people, by the local population, and also that the local population will craft their own city codes or city ordinances or laws, etc., at the local level to address the needs of the locality. So this is, again, very similar to what the United States, of course, has at this time. And of course, this group are known simply as the liberals. And of course, the conservatives want a more centralized system in which in Mexico City, all authority will be concentrated in the capital, again, of Mexico. And from the capital, all decisions will be made, again, across the country. So the states are going to be completely subordinated. The towns across the country will be totally subordinated to Mexico City, to the capital again. So they even want, to create a system of government that will resemble the old colonial system of the viceroy, like a little king or a monarchy or a person that is going to rule the country personally for life. So again, they want to, kind of retain the Spanish system of the past. So again, the conservatives are going to be a very important group here because the kind of policies that they want to implement went against the policies of the liberals. And of course, Texas, as we'll see, is going to remain quite liberal, okay, throughout this period. And of course, what the conservatives actually want contradicts or go against the interests of Texas. And of course, the interest of all the other states, by the way. So once again, the conservatives, for the most part, are people who actually live either in Mexico City itself or in the surrounding areas. Again, so in central Mexico, okay, the so-called conservatives. The vast majority, they're called the centralists or conservatives. They want to centralize authority in the capital. That is to say, there's the large hacendados. They're the members of the church. And of course, army officers of higher ranking, of course, generals and so on, that go back to the royal army, again, of the Spanish monarchy in the past. Those are people that, again, are concentrated in Mexico City, and they want a centralized system. In other words, why? Well, because they believe that by centralizing authority, they're going to actually unify the country and strengthen it. In other words, that's what the country needed, was to bring all the states together, okay, to unify them, as opposed to kind of let each state go loose on their own. And the conservatives fear that this will lead to disintegration, that is to say, that ultimately Mexico will be broken into several fragments, if they were not brought together under the leadership of Mexico City. And of course, culturally, they're very inclined to Spain. They look at Spain for inspiration as to how Mexico should be built. They want Mexico to continue the Spanish cultural heritage, the language, the religion, the traditions of Spain that Mexico inherited. So again, they want to continue with this project, the Spanish project, if you will, for Mexico. They see Mexico as an offspring of Spain. The institutions of governance as well, they want to preserve them. And of course, the most important at this point institution that is still standing, that the Spanish brought in the colonial period, is the Catholic Church. Okay, so the Catholic Church is the standing institution at this time that the conservatives value as important because they believe that Catholicism was going to create a common identity across all of Mexico in order to bring Mexicans together as a common people, to create a sense of community, common identity, if you will, despite of all the ethnic, linguistic differences. Of course, Mexico still has an indigenous population. Over 60% are indigenous in Mexico. There's so many linguistic groups, ethnic groups, and so on. So they want Catholicism to serve as the glue, again, to bring people together so people can identify themselves as Mexicans, that they're part of Mexico, that is to say, because they're Catholic, because we all share the same religion, by the way. So they want to empower the Catholic Church, and they want to protect it, okay, from any type of reforms that will take away any of the, again, of the powers that the church enjoys, like education, for example. Okay, the church is in charge of education at this time, and the church is in charge also of collecting taxes. The church can intervene in politics as well. Priests can actually preach in the pulpit, and it's a great landholder as well. Okay, it owns a lot of land in Mexico. Okay, so it's one of the largest landowners. It owns more land actually than the hacendados, as a matter of fact. So they want to protect that, the conservatives, that is to say. And in terms of modernization, they also look with great interest to the United States, but they don't want to really push the country that fast to modernize and change. They also want to industrialize. They also want to create enterprises, just like in the U.S., but they want gradual, very slow change because of, again, tradition. They want to preserve tradition. They want to preserve the language, the culture, the religion. So they don't want to push this project of trying to industrialize very fast, trying to bring in capital investment and create enterprises that fast, because that will disrupt, again, the traditions, the culture, that is to say. Okay, so this is their vision of the future, and the liberals, otherwise known as the Federalists, do not really agree, okay, with that vision, because liberals, for the most part, during this time, are actually people who come from the provinces, from the states, that is to say, they're not located in Mexico City. Okay, so for the most part. This doesn't mean that there's no liberals in Mexico City, but again, the stronghold, if you will, of the liberals are in the states. Okay, in the individual states. They come from the towns, they come from the capitals of the states. Those are actually merchants, city officials, small landowners, small hacendados, ranchers, for example. Like in Texas, for example, those are actually more liberal. They're liberals, or they were called also Federalists. And they're called like that because, as I mentioned, federalism, again, is a system implemented by the United States in which there's a distribution of powers. That's what federalism is, a distribution of powers between the federal, state, and local levels of government. So the states and the local governments have certain room to craft their own laws as well. So that's a federal system, by the way. So that's what the liberals want. They want Mexico to be a federal republic, just like the U.S., as a matter of fact. And again, most of them are actually in the states. They're criollos, and they're also mestizos. Okay, the provincial criollos. Provincial means the provinces, the states. They're the criollos of the states, and also there's mestizos that are also very, very liberal, and they want, again, that the states retain a certain sense of authority or independence, not total, but again, they want the right for the states and the towns to craft their own laws. So they look at the United States for inspiration, not Spain. This is very important. So the criollos and the mestizo liberals, even though have positive sentiments towards Spain, because ultimately Spain was the mother country of Mexico and pretty much ceded many of the cultural traditions that are so valuable, of course, to the country. Liberals just don't think that Spain, the culture of Spain, was going to create progress for Mexico. Okay, so they say it's all good, it's all beautiful, that we have inherited the traditions of Spain, the language, the religion, the norms, the customs, etc. But ultimately, this is not going to help Mexico advance economically. So what we need is a model that will serve Mexico to actually create wealth, so people's lives advance economically, to improve the standards of living of people, to create a middle class. Okay, so they want to modernize the country. So they look at the United States as an example. And the country to the north, they said, look, the United States is really, creating very, very positive changes for the people because of the introduction of capital in investment, and also enterprises. There's, again, a country of producers and merchants, and it seems that they're generating, of course, wealth. So this is what we need to do. We need to adopt that model of capitalist development. So we need to introduce certain reforms in the country in order to start moving Mexico in that direction. And so they saw that the first step to move Mexico forward in this capitalist development, as they call, to develop capital enterprises and so on of various kinds, is to be able to seize the lands of the church. The church owns a lot of land. Okay, the Catholic Church in Mexico. So, the largest landowner, by the way. It is estimated that over 50% of the land in Mexico is owned, again, by the church. So there's a lot of land that is not being used, is not productive, is just sitting there in idle. So what we need to do is actually privatize the church landholdings in order to break up those lands and into plots, put it on the market for people to buy it. Okay, investors, merchants, entrepreneurs, etc., that will come in, buy that land, and actually develop, develop an enterprise in that land. Might be a farm, might be a ranch, might be an hacienda. But what we need is create those enterprises again. So we need capitalist development. And so they saw the church as an obstacle, that is to say. So they're going to be so adamant to target the church and try to bring about reforms against the church. Now, this is going to be one of the central problems of Mexico for many years to come. The liberals are going against the church, and this is the most important institution of the conservatives, and this is going to cause all of those problems or difficulties, again, the instability that I referred to in the beginning of this class. So they're also, of course, want to introduce a constitution for Mexico. As I mentioned, they want a federalist republic in which again, what the liberals want is to create, again, a system of federalism, a federal model of governance that will reserve a certain degree of autonomy or independence. Autonomy and independence is the same thing for states and the city government. Okay, so they are really adamant in creating this federalist system ever since the start. And they also want a Bill of Rights, of course. It's a charter of rights and liberties, again, that are written down, that formally expresses the rights of citizens, etc., like freedom of the press and freedom of speech, etc., to be clearly stated in the Bill of Rights, just like the U.S., by the way. But there's also, of course, other liberal constitutions. Not only the United States has a Bill of Rights, even the British Constitution has a Bill of Rights, or the French Constitution has a Bill of Rights. So again, what they want is a liberal state, okay, a liberal system of government. The other things, again, they're going to be very, very adamant about is eliminating the immunities of the church and the army, what's called the fueros. Okay. So what is a fuero is, the fuero is simply, again, immunities that the church and the army enjoyed in terms of not being subservient or liable to civil law. Okay, so that whenever the church or members of the church or the army committed an infraction, they will be tried in their own courts. And there were, of course, many instances where the church or members of the army committed those infractions, but again, they were immune. They're called fueros. They had immunities. So what the liberals want is to end that. This is something that was inherited from the colonial system of Spain, okay, where the church and the army were simply immune. And what they want, again, is to transform the system so they can indeed eliminate the fueros altogether. And of course, they want a secular state and a secular education. They want the separation of church and state, in other words, to get the church out of politics and also out of education. So again, children will be educated in a more scientific, of course, system to prepare the country again for a technological future, in other words. So again, we're going to see now at this juncture, again, the creation of the first, Mexican state. So we're going to see that after independence, despite the fact that there were ideological divisions, the first model, the first system of government that was implemented was a very conservative one. The liberals are not going to, at this point, win the day in trying to implement a liberal federal system. The conservatives are going to win the day, and they're simply going ahead and creating an empire, a monarchical system, again, in Mexico, a monarchy. And again, they not only create the monarchy, but declare Mexico to be an empire. Okay, so the monarch was not just ruling over a kingdom. The monarch declares that, is ruling over a Mexican empire. Okay, it's not going to last very long. It only lasted about 2 years or so. And again, this is going to disintegrate rather quickly. So the fathers of the Mexican nation, the ones that actually won the independence, the conservatives, the church, the landowners, and the army were very well known as the monarchists. They were very loyal to the monarchy, to the Spanish monarchy in the past. But when Spain was going too liberal, they declared independence. They were still very monarchical in their ideology, in their preference. So therefore, they pushed forth and to create in Mexico what is called a constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy is that, there's going to be a king. It's going to be an emperor, by the way. And the king is going to rule also alongside a Congress, although the Congress is going to be subordinated to the king. So there's like two branches of government. That's what a constitutional monarchy is. This is not an absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy is when the rules, the laws are made by one person, by the king. But a constitutional monarchy is when the king shares some responsibilities, some powers with Congress, that is to say. So again, this is the system. We're going to have, of course, Agustín de Iturbide, the royal general that actually wins independence for Mexico, who had been fighting the insurgents, by the way. So Agustín de Iturbide was a royal general who had been fighting, of course, the rebels in the past, but now he turns against Spain and he is elected monarch now of Mexico. Okay, so he becomes the emperor. That is to say, Agustín de Iturbide, and now the new Mexican empire begins, an empire that stretches from California and Texas in the northern frontier all the way to Central America. Okay, so this was a large imperial system. If you can see here, Again, it was a large imperial system that stretched from the northern frontier, California, New Mexico, Texas, all the way to Central America. Again, it's not going to last very long. It's going to crumble very quickly for many problems that the empire faced, which is, of course, number one, the disintegration of the Mexican empire had to do with the failure to attain economic development. It could not really kickstart the economy because the independence wars, of course, caused significant disruptions and destruction in the countryside, and many of the enterprises of central Mexico were devastated. Agricultural regions, there were farms, there were areas where the indigenous peoples actually grew their corn. They were all devastated. Mining, large haciendas as well were devastated. Ranches were devastated. So they couldn't recover all of a sudden. So this stagnant economy, this devastated economy was one of the leading causes for the disintegration of the empire, is that Iturbide just did not have a model, some form of a policy to say, well, this is what we're going to do to try to recover, of course, the haciendas or the ranches or the mines, etc. So this is one of the leading causes for the disintegration. Of course, the other is that within Congress itself, there will be opposition to the monarchy. There were some liberals in Congress at this time that are going to form a bloc, a coalition against Iturbide, the monarch. That was Fray Servando Teresa de Mier and Carlos Maria de Bustamante. They led the opposition against Iturbide, which centered on the idea that, we are in the 19th century, and really the monarchies, even in Europe, are facing off. This is a very archaic, old, ancient institution that is not consistent with the times. It's obsolete. It's actually ridiculous. So they made a series of speeches in Congress, even wrote letters and articles in newspapers, really criticizing the king. So it really did gather a lot of momentum, a lot of force, those criticisms. And of course, we're going to see that by 1822, Iturbide was just so criticized that he went ahead and dissolved Congress, and he pretty much closed it down, okay, because of this growing opposition that was, opposing him. So again, those were the liberals, by the way. Liberals are saying, what is this? Okay, so even in Europe, even Europeans are, doing away with their monarchs, by the way. So what are we doing here? Mexico to have a monarchy, so we need to modernize, in other words, we need to move forward. So again, there's going to be, of course, now a struggle in Mexico City between the members of Congress who had been, of course, silenced, or Congress has been closed down. And now there's going to be massive unrest in Mexico City itself against Iturbide, of course. There's going to be even a revolt against the monarchy coming from the army officials, even the army itself. Some members of the army are revolting against the monarchy. And of course, there's going to be a general that is going to be coming forth to lead the revolt in Mexico City. And that was the General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, again, who back in this day, okay, that we're talking about, 1822, 1823, Santa Anna, who came from the state of Veracruz, was considered during this time a war hero because he fought during independence. Okay, during independence, he was actually fighting during the wars of independence, so he was considered a war hero. And so because of that popularity, because of that fame, it was easy for him to actually create a massive following of people and other soldiers from the regiments. And of course, Santa Anna is going to turn against Iturbide, the king. In other words, he's going to actually, drive him out of power. In the so-called Plan de Veracruz, as it was called, Santa Anna pretty much ousts Iturbide from the throne, because he was considered to be a throne. He was considered to be a monarch. And again, he declares Mexico a republic. So he sides at this point with the liberals. He champions the liberal cause, so to speak. Now, historians always look back and say that Santa Anna, in many different points of his life, was actually shifting camps according to the tide. So the conservatives were becoming very unpopular, and the liberals were leading the opposition. They were gaining a lot of popularity. Now he's liberal, of course. But again, Santa Anna was shifting back and forth between liberals and conservatives according to the times, who was actually popular at this time. So again, this is one of the characteristics of this figure. And of course, Santa Anna is going to play a very key role, of course, later on in Texas, as we'll see in the Texas Revolution. So he forced, of course, Iturbide to resign in 1823. Iturbide, the emperor or monarch, actually resigns. And of course, at this point, certain fragments, certain portions of the Mexican Empire, declare independence again. And that is the Central American provinces like Guatemala that were part of Mexico declare independence, of course. So one of the important lessons that this first experiment, this political experiment, left for Mexicans is monarchy is not going to work. Okay, so we don't need a monarchy. We don't need a king. Okay, so this is not what is going to create progress, prosperity, development, etc. in the country. So you got discredited. So there's going to be, of course, a continuous opposition, as we'll see, to centralized authority, particularly when one person is seizing power in Mexico. Mexicans are not going to support. They're not going to follow that. There's going to be ongoing resistance, of course. And this is something that Santa Anna is going to do anyways. Okay, in the 1830s, he's going to become dictator of Mexico in 1836. And again, so this is, even though he was not necessarily a monarch, he was not necessarily calling himself a king, he was ruling Mexico like a king, okay, like an absolute ruler. So we have to understand, again, there's going to be a long-standing tradition of conservatives trying to push some form of monarchical system in Mexico, and yet there's also the liberals, many of whom are actually in Texas as well. Texas is very, very liberal. That will be contesting, of course, the centralized system in which a single individual can rule Mexico for the entire country, make laws or dictate laws, again, to other countries. There's going to be a struggle between what kind of system of government, of course, is going to be proper. Of course, so in 1824, there was the need then to create a different system of government. Of course, Mexico, the liberals now seize control of this process of forming a nation, and they, in 1824, create a republic. The Mexican Republic is created. Okay, so many of the liberals at this time called themselves Republicans. Okay, the rise of the Republicans, the liberals, that is to say, they were in Mexico, the liberals and the Republicans were the same, because again, in Mexico, the idea is that if you were a conservative, you were like a monarchist. In other words, you were a monarchist, you were a conservative. But if you were a liberal, you wanted a republic, like the U.S., in other words, with a federal system of government. Again, this is a system that lasted between 1824 and 1836. There was a constitutional Congress in 1823 on November, that in which delegates from different states of Mexico met in order to write the Constitution of Mexico, the Mexican Constitution of 1824, which it's considered to be not identical, but it's strikingly similar to the Constitution of the United States written in 1787. The Constitution of 1787, where the United States created a republic, okay, the American Republic. So again, those are liberals that see the United States as the model to follow. They want to model the political institutions like Congress, for example, an executive, a judicial branch, Supreme Court, in other words, a distribution of powers between the federal, state, and local government as well, a Bill of Rights, a system of elections, etc. Okay, very similar. So again, this Constitution, of course, left intact certain structures of the past. It did not dismantle the old Spanish institutions. It created a new system of government, very similar to the one in the United States. But what we see is that the church and the army are still very much intact. Those structures, that is to say, the church and state have not yet been totally separated. Okay, the church is still involved in the affairs of the state, in education. It still holds vast tracts of land in Mexico. It collects taxes, from the local population. And of course, the fueros, the immunities I talked about, again, that they're still immune politically from civil laws. Okay. So whenever members of the church actually commit an infraction, they're not going to be tried in civil laws. Of course, members of the army likewise. So there was a compromise in which the liberals couldn't just create a new country and dismantle all the old institutions. Okay, so they're still going to have to face, again, the fact that there's still a church, very strong, and an army. And again, this is going to pose many, many problems in the future. Okay, so the significance of this, of course, is that, for example, when we look at Texas, Catholicism still, the official religion of the state. The Catholic Church is the central church of the nation. So at this time, the idea that we're going to have diversity of opinion and thought and belief, etc., in terms of religion, again, that we're going to have, competition, that the Catholic Church will allow other religions to come in and create, that is not really, something that the country still allows, because the Catholic Church still remain, of course, very much in power. So see that, again, in terms of how Texas, as we'll see in just a moment, is going to receive an influx of American settlers, many of whom were not Catholic, by the way. They're bringing their own Protestant, denominations, their Protestant faiths. And of course, this is going to create a certain conflict when Mexico is trying to impose Catholicism, if you will, on the land across the nation, because it still remains part of the state, if you will. So at any rate, so again, there is going to be, of course, in the new republic, also a series of ordeals and problems that the new republic is going to face. Economic and political instability, again, are going to be rampant. Economic, for example, hardships, again, of the first presidency. The first president of this republic, Guadalupe Victoria, he's confronted with the foreign debt. For example, that there's a foreign debt, there's, creditors knocking on Mexico's doors to collect debt. And because there's poor revenue collection in the country, we don't have an efficient, modern system of administration that collects taxes and revenues. There's still a lot of tax avoidance. There's a lot of people don't pay taxes. There's no way to collect them, and so on. So there's no way to raise those revenues to pay those foreign creditors. So that's, again, something that the country was facing initially. In 1828, when there will be elections, because in Mexico at this time, presidents were elected every 4 years. We're going to see trouble elections. Once again, the conservatives are reorganizing and they're trying to seize control of Mexico, to try to direct Mexico in a different direction. They fear, in other words, that the liberals, if they continue to be in office, that they will be just a matter of time when they will introduce reforms to reduce the power of the church and the power of the army, by the way. So the liberals won the elections of 1828, but there's going to be a back and forth, okay, between the conservatives that also claim victory, and now the conservatives are celebrating and they say they won the election. So the liberals refuse to recognize the conservative victory. Because again, there's of course, the issue of fraud, etc. And ultimately, in the end, both groups, both factions are simply claiming victory, that they won the election. So they come forth and at the same time say, we won, of course. So, this is, of course, going to lead to turmoil in Mexico. The centralists or the conservatives, what they were attempting to do was to actually stage a revolution. In other words, after the celebration of their victory, their so-called victory, they're going to rally the masses and say, we won the election, so let's go and, occupy, the presidency by force, drive out the liberals, and so on and so forth. So what they really want is to just go ahead and, again, overthrow the liberals, in other words, that had won the elections, but they just don't recognize the results. They say they won, and what they want is to move people into, again, Mexico City in order to stage a revolution, by the way, of course. So this is, again, an instability. The centralists or the conservatives are trying to now seize control of the state. And Santa Anna here intervenes, by the way. He comes into Mexico and intervenes on behalf of the liberals. He crushes the conservative revolution, and he saved the liberals, at least for a while. But, at this point, many liberals have been, of course, persecuted and lynched. There were, of course, many deaths, many casualties in Mexico City, because there was actually fighting going on. It was not just people that were, in the streets and, being rallied, etc., but rather there was fighting in the streets in Mexico City. So again, Santa Anna will have to come in, leave the state of Veracruz, his home state, march into Mexico City, and pretty much kind of restore order. And he sides with the liberals at this point. Okay, so this is, again, something that we have to keep in mind when we look at the Texas Revolution much later. So again, in 1829, also Mexico faced an invasion from Spain. Spain was trying to regain control of Mexico, recolonize it, in other words. And the Spaniards launched a naval invasion into Tampico. Okay, it's Tampico, the state of Tampico, and the port of Tampico, I'm sorry, in the state of Tamaulipas, just south of Texas, by the way. So so in the neighboring province or state of Texas to the south in the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to see that the Spaniards are arriving. They're launching an invasion. And of course, Santa Anna will have to also intervene, of course, on behalf of Mexico in trying to expel the Spanish forces. This is done as a result, of course, of the Spaniards trying to reconquer Mexico. When Mexico, of course, in 1828, 1829, expelled the Spaniards out of Mexico. So the president, Vicente Guerrero, actually expelled Spaniards, many of whom owned land, many of them were merchants, had assets and investments in Mexico. And of course, he really expelled a very important group that was, again, very productive in Mexico. It actually ended up weakening the economy, by the way, because he goes against a very important class of people. So when they go to Spain, they complain that Mexico had seized their assets, had expelled them. So again, this is one of the reasons why Spain launches this invasion into Tampico in present-day Mexico. Santana goes to that region. Again, he takes a force from Veracruz and Mexico City. He goes to the north in the Gulf of Mexico and expels the Spanish forces. So this is yet another moment when Santana again gains popularity. Okay, first as an independence war hero, and then of course, taking Iturbide, forcing Iturbide to resign from the throne of Mexico, going into Mexico City in 1828 to restore order after all the chaos and the revolution that was taking place, and now, of course, expelling the Spanish forces. So again, it's one of the reasons why he's going to grow so much popular, to the point that, as we'll see much later, he'll simply go again and declare himself dictator. In 1836, he just thought he had the popularity, the support of Mexico, the fame, to actually, present himself as a hero and a savior. And of course, the centralization of authority is going to take place in 1836, something we're going to see more closely in the following subject, in the following topic, in the Texas Revolution. So again, in 1830, what we're going to see is that the turmoil continues. The conservatives strike back once again in 1830, when Vicente Guerrero, the liberal president who won the elections of 1828, was executed. Okay, this is a conservative revolution. The conservatives really want to seize control of the state. Okay, so they go ahead and execute the president in 1831. And so they install a conservative in power by the name of Anastasio Bustamante, who is now persecuting liberals right and left. I mean, he wants to purge Mexico from the liberals, so he's really closing down newspapers, silencing editors and politicians, etc. So it really goes against them on a rampage. So again, this is the type of politics that prevailed in Mexico when Texas was part of Mexico. Okay, so Mexican politics were in turmoil. There are two groups competing for the office, for the presidency, to implement policies that will either shape the country in a very conservative way, like Spain, in a very monarchical, centralized way in Mexico City, or in a kind of federalist, liberal way. So again, there's going to be two forces competing again for the future of Mexico. And of course, this is producing, of course, a lot of instability. Santana ends up, of course, coming back to Mexico in order to get Bustamante out of office, by the way, because of the atrocities. He was really committing a lot of atrocities, persecuting the liberals, putting many of them in jail or those executions, etc. And so Santana was asked to intervene once again, goes to Mexico City, and actually deposes Bustamante, but then he becomes president in 1833, which, by the way, he is not going to be in office in Mexico City all this time. He becomes the president, but he leaves somebody else in office. He actually leaves, etc. He'll come back whenever, people need him. So again, this is the situation, of course, that Mexico was facing between 1821 and 1836. So again, there were, of course, revolts and counter-revolts going back and forth. Just to give you an idea, between 1833 and 1855, there were 36 presidents in Mexico. And just to give you an idea, again, so we're talking about a roughly 22-year period, roughly 2 decades. There were 36 presidents, okay, during this time. Santana was 11 times president, precisely during this process. So talk about instability, okay, in Mexico. So again, Texas, being so far, if you will, removed from Mexico City, is looking with great interest at this development, But being so liberal is not that enticing to be part of a system so unstable, if you will. So you'll see how the liberals are not going to rely or depend upon Mexico City. They're simply going on their own way, creating their own towns, etc., developing on their own, because again, Mexico is just simply so unstable. Of course, political corruption was also endemic in Mexico during this time. Santana, for example, acquired a 1.5 million acre estate, one of the largest ranches, of course, in Mexico, in Veracruz, a gigantic piece of property that he owned. So this is just one example, but there were other minor officials, again, that were also in charge of, selling offices. So if you wanted to occupy an office, an administrative office, a political office, you simply buy it. Okay, you can just buy, the office and use the office to enrich yourself. That's the issue. Again, so in many instances, what public officials were actually doing is using the office to plunder the treasury. Okay, so whatever monies were available, again, in the municipality or in the state or in Mexico City, those public officials were simply, again, plundering those treasuries. Again, it was, some of the problems. And of course, the lack of economic development and modernization in the country. The fact is that we're not going to see any serious change economically speaking, in terms of trying to industrialize the country, bring in factories, trying to bring foreign investment in Mexico per se. Now, this is going to happen in Texas, by the way, because Texas was very close to the United States at this time. There will be, of course, some form of development taking place, something we're going to see just in a few seconds here. But throughout Mexico, we're not going to see that. We're not going to see commercial agriculture, the creation of plantations, again, for exports, for example. We're not going to see that as well during this time. And foreign trade. Foreign trade was virtually non-existent during this time precisely because of the instability, the political instability that I just said. Even there were no roads to speak of, okay? There were no roads. There were all dirt roads, mud roads, again, all scattered across Mexico, that even it was difficult for merchants to move merchandise with ox carts, again. So, again, this is the state of Mexico during this time. It could not really move forward because the two groups that were removing each other constantly, from office, even before the end of the year, when an elected official, a president was in office, he will be out. There were presidents that only served 11 months in office or less. So at any rate, so now that we understand that situation, let's look at Texas itself. So just concentrating on this particular state between 1821 and 1836. So this is the third part that is going to look at now Texas itself, Mexican Texas, as it is called. We first provided an overview of the independence process, so you'll gain a sense of how Mexico was transformed in the colonial period that led to the conditions of independence, which groups existed, of course, during this time that competed for the independence of Mexico, how they were affected during the colonial period for them to come together to gain independence. We also look at the macro picture of Mexico, so you'll gain a sense of when Texas was part of Mexico, what was Mexico like? The formation of the Mexican state, which particular groups were fighting, how they were trying to push Mexico forward, which models they were, advocating, and so on, and the instability, of course. the instability that existed throughout this process between 1821 and 1833, and how Santa Anna, of course, is going to rise during this process as a central figure that many people actually called upon during times of crises, whenever there were uprisings, revolutions, or persecutions, etc. Santa Anna will be playing a critical role again. So this is important for understanding, of course, the future of the course, particularly when we move into the Texas Revolution. But again, it's also important to understand Mexican Texas, because Mexico was part of Texas during this time. And Texas was, like I said, very liberal. Okay, it was, again, merchants, rancheros, local officials, etc. Even the immigrant groups that are going to be coming, of course, are going to be very, very liberal. And they're looking with great interest at what's happening, of course, in Mexico City. So, part 3, Mexican Texas from 1821 to 1836, is going to look at some of the social changes that are taking place in Texas itself. Now, when Texas, being part of Mexico, again, when Mexico gained independence in 1821, Texas had about 4,000 people living in the entire state at the moment of independence itself, 1821. But the population is going to increase significantly, that by 1836, there will be more than 40,000 people, okay, living in this state. Okay, so there will be an increase, of course, of populations, many of whom are coming from North America, the vast majority, of course. So let's look at this again. A population increase, which groups were coming in, and what kind of ideas were important, the economic activities were important, etc., for those groups in terms of how they started shaping, of course, Texas during the Mexican period. So let's look at the first group here, the first social group, again, that is going to come in, of course, is we're talking about, of course, Anglo-American immigration. Okay, Anglo-American immigration. There's going to be a large influx, again, of people coming from the United States, from various parts of the United States. The vast majority, not all, are coming from the southern states, from the U.S. South. A great many, not all of them. Okay, it's important to understand that not all of them are coming from the U.S. South. And of course, this is a process that started out with, of course, Mexico in 1821 pursuing precisely an immigration policy for Texas. So Mexico itself wanted to bring people over into this region for various reasons. And of course, I will outline those reasons. There were 4 main reasons why Mexico is pursuing this immigration policy and pretty much opening the doors for American settlement in Texas, by the way. So, number 1, it's what Mexico is doing in the initial months, again, of independence, is just trying to honor and expand the treaty that Spain, before independence was gained, had signed with an individual by the name of Moses Austin, who signed a treaty with the Spanish authorities in 1821 to bring 300 families, of course, and to give a series of land grants both to Moses Austin and also to those 300 families that will be invited to settle in Texas and actually become part of Mexico. So the idea is you're going to come in, bring 300 families, we're going to give them land for farming and so on. And so they're going to become Mexicans, that is to say. So the idea is we need to populate this region and we need to bring people over. The fact is that not a lot of people from Mexico, let's say from Mexico City or the southern states in Mexico, wanted to come to Texas. They just don't want to leave their place of comfort in Mexico itself that is comfortable because it's very productive. There's plenty of grain. It's a region that is already pretty much civilized, so to speak. You find towns, you find cities, ports, trade, ranches, and so on. So why would you leave that place in order to go to a place in which you'll have to develop everything from scratch? And might be very dangerous too, because there probably you'll be facing Native American groups there that will not welcome you. Might be the weather might be colder than in central Mexico. Okay, might be more arid, drier, and so on and so forth. So so Mexicans don't have a great interest of moving up north. So again, Spain was preoccupied with that, and so he wanted to actually populate in the northern frontier, and signed a treaty with Moses Austin to bring 300 families. And so it was actually signed just before independence was signed. So when finally Mexico was created with Agustin de Iturbide, the emperor, and independence was won, and Spain is no longer in control, that treaty was still there. And now Iturbide is going to kind of honor, if you will, that treaty and sign it into law and allow Moses Austin to actually go ahead with the process of American colonization of Texas. So he's just trying to honor and expand this Spanish Austin Treaty, as it was called. And of course, just again, one of the reasons why Mexico is moving forward is that, well, we already have a treaty. So now let's make it real. And it is important, of course, to bring people over, because there's just 4,000 people living in this entire province. 4,000, which is just a handful, of course, of towns. There were like 4 towns that were actually, settled, only 4 towns at this time. And so it was necessary to actually, increase the population. The second reason why they're pursuing an American immigration here in Texas, Mexico, is for it's called defensive immigration. So what they want to do is that there were 4 towns, of course, populated by Mexicans, or Tejanos they were called, San Antonio, Goliad, Nacogdoches, Laredo. And what they want is to bring American settlers so they can actually build their settlements, their farms north of San Antonio, so they can serve as a buffer or a barrier, between the Tejanos that are in the southern portion of the state and the Comanches that are in the northern region of the state. And of course, the Comanches have been, of course, behaving quite hostile throughout the colonial period, and they continue to behave very hostile. So they want, of course, the Americans to pretty much come into the middle as a barrier, if you will, to protect the towns of the South. It's called defensive immigration, a buffer, if you will. Okay, that's the other. They also, of course, are trying to establish firm claims in the northern frontier, because, as I mentioned, those states, whether we're talking about New Mexico, whether we're talking about California or Texas, just lack population. They're not populated, so it will be very easy to lose it. Okay, it will be very easy for, again, other groups to come in and pretty much, seize those territories. So what they want is to populate it with people that will have some form of loyalty, allegiance to Mexico. So there are Mexicans living there, and Mexican citizens in this case. So again, the country can establish a firm claim in the northern frontier. It's also trying to push people from Mexico up north. It's in giving land grants, incentivizing people to move upward and so on into the northern frontier. And this process is going very slow. So that's why they want to also bring in Americans, of course, into this region in order to establish a firm claim into those lands as well. But there's just a fourth reason why Mexico is pursuing a colonization policy, an American colonization policy, is that by bringing people over, then they can actually push forth the economic reforms, the political reforms that I've been talking about, the liberals, that is to say, in that their idea is that they want to privatize the church land holdings. Okay, the missions in Texas own a lot of land. Okay, there's more than 26 missions, all scattered across Texas. 26 missions, the Catholic missions, that is to say, and they own a lot of land. It's not just the mission itself, but there's the surrounding areas, a vast tract of land that the mission holds. So what the liberals in this case in Mexico want is that by bringing immigration, by bringing immigrants, that Texas will have to actually privatize the lands of the missions in order to actually sell it or grant it to the newcomers so they can develop farms or plantations or ranches for the land to be more productive, that is to say. So they want productivity. They don't want the land to be sitting there. So they say the Americans are going to bring enterprises. That's for sure. So again, this is going to force the privatization schemes again of the mission land holdings, and of course, in the process, dismantle the Catholic institution. Okay, so this is another reason why, they're actually pushing for immigration in Texas as much as possible. So again, in 1824, there will be in Mexico City a new law called the National Colonization Law of 1824 that accelerates this process of colonization. American colonization, that is to say. And that what this National Colonization Law stated was that it actually gave states almost total control of their immigration policy. In other words, every state has now the authority to bring in as many people as they want. Okay, this is not going to be dictated from Mexico City. Mexico City is not going to put quotas, but rather is going to write a blank check, if you will, okay, to the states. So like here, Texas can just open the doors, of course, to more people come in, as many as they want, in other words. And so they're looking at Texas as this great experiment, is that maybe this is going to incentivize even more people to come over. At this time, the son of Moses Austin, Stephen Austin, of course, is renewing the treaty of his father to even bring more people into this region. This is what Moses Austin, again, is renewing the treaty after the National Colonization Law. So Moses Austin sees an opportunity that maybe we can actually renew the treaty and actually bring more people. Okay, so I'll have more access to land grants, and of course, access to bring far more people so they can come over, of course, into this region and search for land. And of course, he's going to turn that into an enterprise itself, as we'll see in just a second. A land developer, as it is called. You get a land grant to bring people, you divide it, you probably sell it, or additional lands that you can actually sell it to other people, again, that might be interested, firms or plantation owners, etc. You can commercialize with it, in other words. So he's going to turn that colonization process into an enterprise, in other words, Moses Austin, that is. So in 1825, we're going to see the creation, of course, of Coahuila and Tejas. In other words, in Mexico City, the decision was, well, let's merge Coahuila and Texas into a single state. And of course, Saltillo, Coahuila, is going to be the capital of this new state called Coahuila and Tejas in 1825. Okay, we're going to see that. And with that, of course, we're going to see the introduction of yet another state colonization law that was passed by this new state called Coahuila and Tejas in 1825 to further accelerate the colonization process again here. And that is, we have to bring more people to Coahuila and Tejas, again, with both Mexicans and Americans through what is called empresario contracts. What an empresario contract is that there will be an individual, okay, an immigration agent that is totally private, land developer, like Moses Austin, for example, that will be issued a contract in which if that person brings 100 families to Coahuila and Tejas, he'll be given additional, as form of payment or gratitude, he'll be given land, thousands of acres of land to him, to that particular person. So that will provide an incentive, if you will, for that individual to look for people to come and settle in this region, because if he brings, of course, 100 families or more, he's going to get a land grant, a huge one, of course. So that actually turned into a business itself, that, this is something that we can actually, create a business off, immigration. Bring people over, sign a contract, get the contract, of course, and then collect the land grant, in other words, at the end. This colonization law also tried to encourage farming and ranching. In other words, the creation of farms, the creation of ranches, of course, across the Coahuila and Texas, to foster commercial enterprises, to create investment, people invest in ranching, etc. That was the idea. Again, they want to modernize this region. The only issue, again, is that immigrants must abide by Mexican law, customs, and religion. Once again, yes, you can bring people over, but they're going to be Mexican citizens and abiding by Mexican law, customs, and also the Catholic faith, by the way. Okay. So once again, what we're going to see that in Texas itself, in the region that today we call Texas itself, there will be, of course, significant numbers of people arriving, of course, to this region under those empresario contracts. So we're going to see the rise of the empresarios, the land developers that are actually obtaining land grants for bringing 100 families. So if you bring 100 families, you establish a series of plots, give each family a plot of land for farming, etc. That individual will be awarded, again, with a large land grant as well. And so just in Texas alone, we're going to see the creation of 41 land contracts. Again, 41 land contracts that brought 13,500 American families. Okay. So 41 land contracts were issued, between 1825 and 1836, and that allow for the introduction of 13,500 American families. And of course, once the empresarios or land developers brought, again, the people, the land grants, of course, that they obtained for bringing those families over were used for speculation. So what speculation is, of course, is the idea of what today just simply call real estate. Okay, so you pretty much start creating a real estate enterprise, a real estate company, which, well, you've been given a lot of land for having brought a lot of people. So what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to commercialize with that land. Okay, you're going to speculate. Well, is this land valuable? Can you build something productive here? Let's say a cotton plantation, a farm, a cattle ranch. Okay, so if that's the case, then you're going to divide that land into certain regions or plots and actually sell it to entrepreneurs or industrialists, or you can plantation owners, etc., ranchers and so on. So again, so you turn that into a business, what is called a real estate company. That is to say, Stephen F. Austin was very much involved, but he's not going to be the only one actually involved. There will be significant competition in Texas between the land developers. There will be several. And of course, there will be even New York firms, real estate, again, firms that will be coming to Texas precisely because there was the opportunity to bring people over, get a land grant, and from the land grant, they're going to actually develop a real estate company. There were particularly two real estate companies created in Texas by New York developers, the Galveston Bay and the Texas Land Company. Two, again, real estate companies were created out of this process, this empresario contracts, again, that I just mentioned. That is bringing a lot of Americans over. And of course, the New York firms are competing with Austin. They're rivals, if you will, in this idea that, well, who's going to dominate the real estate market? Who's going to receive more land grants? Who's going to bring more people over? And who's going to have, of course, the real estate marketing control? So there's going to be significant competition created in this process, of course, of colonization, the creation of real estate. So that what meant that is that this immigration, this increasing population is going to lead to, of course, a multicultural society. okay, in Texas. A multicultural society in which, on one hand, we're going to have the native Mexicans of Texas. Those were the native Mexicans. There were 4,000 in 1821, again, living in Texas or thereabouts. Again, they were living in this Hispanic towns of San Antonio, Laredo, Goliad, Nacogdoches, including the little town of Victoria. Those were the Hispanic towns in which the predominant population were of Hispanic descent. By the way, the so-called native Texans that were still carrying their Catholic traditions. They were actually Catholic. There were actually local churches there that attended the Mass, and they professed the Catholic faith. They were also in the native Hispanic population, the Tejanos. There were also small farmers. There were, families that owned small plots of land that were actually using that land for self-subsistence farming. In other words, they were just growing their own food. That is to say, we got, again, the situation that whether it's in San Antonio or in Goliad or Laredo, people are also, again, families, again, pretty much conducting their economic activities of farming in a very small scale. And of course, we got merchants, particularly in San Antonio. There's going to be merchants that will be trading with Mexico. Clothing, textiles, again, that people weave will be carried to the south across the Rio Grande River into the border and going into Coahuila. Again, there will be trade taking place between San Antonio and Coahuila. The merchants, that is to say, the Hispanic population, tradespeople, you'll find that in those towns, tailors, barbers, blacksmiths. They were very common that in every town you'll find those tradespeople. And of course, the most prominent group of the native Hispanic population, the native Mexicans of Texas, were the cattle ranchers. They were the dominant economic group that experienced actually a resurgence in the 1820s after the wars of independence that had shattered that industry in Texas, of course, led most of the ranches pretty much destroyed, but they're recovering very fast in the 1820s, and the ranchero families are on the ascent. They're once again creating wealth for themselves as a result of their cattle ranching trade, particularly. In Victoria, we see the Martin de Leon, family led by Martin de Leon, for example, very dominant. Erasmo and Juan Seguin in Bexar or Bejar, Carlos de la Garza in Goliad, also, again, one of the most prominent rancheros, Mexican rancheros. And of course, not only were, the large cattle ranchers, the wealthy cattle ranchers, of course, dominating in those towns, that industry, but also, again, there were about 350 rancherias, family-owned small cattle ranches, of course, scattered also across this region. 350 rancherias, that's a lot. Of course, so cattle ranching was central to the economic life of Mexican Tejanos during this time. Of course, we're also going to see Anglos, of course, settlers in Texas, and this is another group of Texas society that are also going to play a critical role, of course, in shaping the economic foundation of Texas. Of course, it's not just the cattle ranching, but also we're going to see the influx of Anglo-Americans due to those colonization policies that I just described. And of course, they're going to be the pioneers. Of course, there were pioneers in the frontier coming in and trying to pretty much transform the landscape, from scratch. So they had to do the work on their own, of course, work very hard in terms of trying to survive in this environment. Even though that they were given the land was not developed. So they will have to develop the land and work it, level it or clear it, so on, and try to build, of course, a house there, a cabin, etc. So start from the ground up, in other words, and in many cases had to resort to certain survival strategies like hunting, fishing. They practice even gardening as well as survival strategies that kept them going, that is to say. So again, this was a very, very rough, in a way of starting a community as they're coming into Texas, that is to say, building log cabins. They were in charge of building, actually, 18 new towns across Texas. So originally there were 4 or 5 that were actually populated at the time of independence, but with the influx of Anglos, of course, we're going to see, of course, the growing, the building of 18 new towns by the Anglo settlers. Okay, so they introduced farming into Texas. Many of them began to develop farms and cotton plantations as well. We're going to see the development of cotton plantations because cotton had become very profitable in the United States, price commodity. We're going to talk about that, in the Texas Revolution and later on, of course, in the Civil Wars. Why cotton was so prized. But again, during the 1820s, early 1830s, the Anglo-American plantation owners were already producing 7,000 bales of cotton per year, just from Texas alone. They traded, of course, also products that they grew like corn, deerskin, salted meat, and timber. So they're very industrious. They're carrying out trade and so on. And this is how they're building their economic institutions, of course. In farming, once again, they're, conducting also, in cotton plantations and also trade, and establishing their own schools, their private schools in many cases, and also their independent religious gatherings. So they're supposed to abide by the Catholic, of course, norms and be Catholic. But the fact is that many of the new towns they're building don't have a church. So the Catholic Church is not in charge of sending priests or trying to build missions in those places. So what we see is that the Anglo-American population in Texas are simply carrying out their own Protestant religious activities independently by gathering, of course, in homes, etc., in different locations, and continuing their Protestant faith. So by 1833, there were already 30,000 Americans living in Texas versus 4,000 Tejanos. So again, this is the situation again, that we're going to see 30,000 Americans by 1833 and 4,000 Tejanos. And so, again, this had a significant increase in the population. Most of, again, the new immigrants are located in the central parts of Texas, but also in the east part of Texas as well. And again, they're not going to be the only ones coming. There's also going to be, of course, African slaves. There will be, of course, the growing presence of what's called blacks, of course, of African slaves in this region, many of whom are coming with plantation owners in order to actually, provide the labor in the cotton agriculture, just like in the South, by the way. And of course, we're going to see the growing presence, of course, of African slavery in Texas during this time, something that the Mexican Tejanos, of course, kind of agreed, meaning that they believed that this institution, the plantation itself, was going to be a very productive enterprise that would generate, of course, revenues for the state. It will probably modernize it. It will modernize the ports. Okay, it will have international ports for exports and so on. So they compromised on the issue of slavery on economic grounds, even though slavery had been pretty much abolished in 1813 in Mexico in the independence process. It was not something that was turned into a law, but during independence, in the Declaration of Independence of Mexico in 1813, the leaders of independence said, we're going to hereby abolish slavery. But that was something that was declared in the independence process. It was drafted, if you will, but was not turned into a national law per se. It was just something that Mexicans agreed that, again, because this was an idea, a goal of independence, we're not going to actually pursue slavery in Mexico. But Texas, of course, is going to go ahead and trying to open the doors, compromise on the issue of slavery by passing a decree. One Texan, the representative in Congress, Jose Antonio Navarro, from Texas, who was serving in Congress, actually passed a decree of 1828 saying, well, we're not going to have slaves in Texas. When slaves come into Texas, there will be considered indentured servants, not slaves, that will be earning their freedom through their work in a process of 99 years. So again, in reality, this was just a law that says we're not going to name them slaves, but they are. We're just going to name them indentured servants, that is to say. So again, that kind of opened the doors for the introduction of African slaves. 5,000 slaves came in by 1836. So very significant, again, presence, again, of African slaves in Texas as a result of cotton production, cotton plantations, again, coming into this region. Of course, there's the Indian population. This is another group. Of course, there were several groups. We mentioned that in the beginning of the semester. In Texas, the Coahuiltecans that were located in present-day Coahuila, in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, in the Rio Grande area, and also in parts of South Texas. And it is estimated by the 1820s, again, there's no trace of Coahuiltecans because the population had been reduced to famine, epidemics, and acculturation. Many of them were acculturated into the ways of life of Spain and now Mexico, and they were now living amongst the peoples of Mexico, mixing with the populations again of the towns, etc. So they're probably descendants of them, but they are not together preserving their distinct ethnic and cultural heritage. That is to say, there's other Indian groups that develop survival strategies. However, in Texas, other Indian groups in Texas, precisely because the population is increasing, the Tejano population, the Mexican Tejanos, and the Anglo settlers. So there was the need for those Indian groups to actually develop survival strategies. For example, the Karankawas are going to rely on raiding cattle ranches. Okay, the cattle ranches will be raided and the cattle will be stolen as a means of subsistence. In other words, you can always raid a cattle ranch, steal a cow, and, slaughter it, feed people. And again, it's a form of hunting, but you're raiding, of course, an enterprise in this case. So the Karankawas will resort to that kind of strategy. The Comanches are going to resort to farming, even though they were hunters and gatherers in the past. They're going to learn how to grow their own food. They're going to engage in trade as well. And they will be trading goods back and forth. And also at times they're also using warfare. So they're not going to be remaining hunters and gatherers constantly at war with the settlers, but they're going to develop different survival strategies like farming, trade, and warfare, of course. The Caddo Indians to the north faced their own problems inside their communities, like alcoholism, and that they were trying to, attend to. And they resorted to trade as well with Louisiana as a means of survival, that maybe what we need to do is engage in trade. We're having our problems of our own. Our communities are ridden with alcoholism. Maybe what we need to do is, of course, perhaps engage in trade, not be in constant warfare or resistance with other groups, but rather engage in trade. And of course, we're going to see a large influx, again, of people coming into Texas, immigrant groups, Indian tribes coming into Texas. This is going to be a large wave of, Indian groups arriving into Texas, the Cherokees, Kickapoos, Shawnees, Delawares, the Alabamas, for example. They're going to come in as a result of a population increase that is taking place in the United States. Many of them are leaving those regions and they're coming into Texas, in the northern regions of Texas. They're settling and they're learning how to farm. They're developing their own animal farms and trade. And of course, the Indian population of Texas is going to increase. It will become more diverse, and it will include so many different groups that were not necessarily, of course, the groups that had inhabited traditionally this region. like the Comanches, the Apaches, the Carancaguas, for example, the Humanos, the Coahuiltecans, but rather there's new groups arriving again into Texas as well. Okay, so this is the end of our of this topic of Mexico and the Mexican nation. And there will be three key terms, by the way, extracted from this discussion: the independence from Spain, the ordeals of the new Mexican nation, and Mexican Texas. So those are going to be on the exam. Again, this is a very important thing that, again, you have to pay attention to. That's all I have for you as for now. And this is the end of this topic. This is the end of session 3. This is the end of this topic on Texas and the Mexican nation. And of course, later on, we're going to open up a new topic, which is the Texas Revolution. Will be the 4th topic coming next. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.